Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of our healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multi-disciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode of the show, we speak to Bronwen Davies about bereavement from a clinical psychologist perspective. Bronwen Davies, welcome to the show. So we're really glad to have you on board. Welcome on board.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here.
So I have to ask, Shez, how did you even find Bronwen in terms of doing the show?
So to be very honest, it's coming up on the 15-year anniversary of my sister's passing, and my mom's sort of struggling a little bit at the moment. So when I was going through just my Facebook pages, I came across your page, and you had a post up on the day. So I think it just spoke to me, but the post was, grief never ends, it changes. And I kind of sat there and thought, well, that's actually so true. And then kind of reached out from there and figured bereavement's a subject that so few people actually talk about. And grief is something that so few people actually talk about or even understand. I thought, well, this is definitely something that I would like to be able to put information out there for people to be able to get a little bit of a better understanding, or to help somebody that they know who might be going through a period of bereavement.
Well, I'm really glad it spoke to you on that day. Sure. Amazing.
So, it goes to show how little we know about all of these interconnections. Hey? I would have never put that. We didn't speak about it before, but that's interesting that she has shared something so vulnerable as well. But yeah, it's actually interesting. We had an OT on recently, and we were talking about, the whole COVID-19 and pandemic, and she specializes in the workplace. And you know how the suicide rates apparently have gone up over this time.
It's awful. And it's really awful.
So I think maybe just to start it off, Bronwen, tell us a little, that's your area of specialization, bereavement. Maybe tell us a little bit about that and why you decided that that's one of your areas of specialization.
Well, first of all, I would honestly say I don't specialize in it. I just have chosen it as one of the areas I focus on. And it was partly through my own experience of loss, but also because I felt that it was a neglected area. I got involved also with the Cancer Counseling Society, and that made me think about how little was being done to cope with grief and bereavement. I just feel as if it's an area that people find very hard to talk about and very hard to deal with. And there are lots of sort of shoulds. You should be this and you should be that, and you shouldn't be this and you shouldn't be that. And it's so unhelpful. And people don't know what to say when you lose somebody. They don't know what to say to you. So I think that's where the interest was sparked. And then I sort of focused on it. I work with adults and older, sort of varsity age, teenage and up. So it's not as if I specialize in bereavement, but it's definitely an area I focus on.
Thanks for clarifying that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose the reason for asking the question as well is that we spoke, I think, just briefly before the show as well, is, one of the reasons we wanted to do something like the Moulding Health Show was when people normally get onto Google, they don't know what to search for. And, what we're hoping is that if they're searching for bereavement, this episode will come up and they kind of put together, okay, maybe I can see a clinical psychologist about this, and so they don't really have to, struggle in silence. They do know that there's other avenues, and then maybe they listen to this and they say, okay, I really like what, Bronwen is saying, maybe I would like to make an appointment, or I'd like to take some of the suggestions that she put out there, and go with that. So I think that's the reason I was asking around the specialization part. But I would like to know, how do your clients normally find you? Do they specifically come in and they say, I was searching for someone to help me through this?
It's a good question. Originally, when I started practicing, it was word of mouth. So what I mean by that is I don't take referrals really from clients. I'm quite strict about not seeing friends of clients or family of clients. So the word of mouth I'm talking about is from other professionals. So it would be from psychiatrists, from GPs, occasionally from other mental health professionals like psychologists whose practices are full or who are looking for somebody in my geographical suburb. Now I also have my name on a couple of websites, and people, I don't know whether they Google the area, as in Rivonia, or whether they Google bereavement or trauma or narcissism, and then they send me emails and we work from there. So
it's interesting that you put
answers
narcissism there.
Yeah, it's very trending. It was a trending word last year and possibly the year before, and for a little bit it was trending. Everybody was suddenly decided they lived with narcissists or worked with narcissists, and the awareness is marvelous. But yeah, so that was a trending word a while ago.
Okay, that's so interesting. I also like what you said, about getting, I don't think I've ever heard someone mention that, referrals from other therapists and not really direct referrals.
Yes, definitely. Yeah,
that's interesting.
A lot, actually. And then we also have, talking of what Shaz said, that she found me via Facebook. We have a Facebook group for psychologists where we refer to each other there. Or we ask for who's available to see somebody such, and we don't reveal any details. It's all very confidential, but then you make yourself available and say, well, I can see that person, or I have space, or that's also very useful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think, so when we started many years ago, my wife's a clinical psychologist, and I always said, but, putting my business hat on, I always say, you need a website, you need this, and, for like over 10 years, she told me, no, I can't do that, and I can't do this. And it's funny how the space has opened up, to where, to how we're talking now, but I think if I approached you in 97, when you said you opened your private practice, there's no way you would have even taken, like our call. But it's interesting, like that awareness and how the world's changed. To that.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I also find there's so much less shame about seeing a psychologist than there was when I first started over 20 years ago. There's a lot less shame. People are so much more open to coming to therapy. I see more men who are self-referred. They haven't been dragged here unwilling by spouses or partners. It's really, there is obviously still some embarrassment, so people will seek out a coach rather than a psychologist, but it's less, definitely getting less. The stigma is less.
I agree with that. But I did say, when we get to a stage where you can say, in a corporate setting, you can say, I'm going to go see my psychologist at 10 o'clock and I can't make that meeting. I think then we would have got there. But until that happens, I think we're getting there slowly, but there's still that, that stigma to it. But definitely better than it was 5-10 years ago.
I agree.
And I think psychologists are going to be busy for quite some time. I think the last 2 years, we don't even know what the consequences of this are. We talked about, suicide rates during the pandemic and stuff like that. But I think people are struggling at the moment, whether they realize it or not. And, the changes and stuff like that. And I think also with the pandemic, we cannot speak about bereavement. And I wonder.
It's actually, there is a link. I'm interrupting you rudely, Oliver, but there is actually a link between the topic we're going to talk about today, bereavement, and what has happened with COVID. Because the world, the planet, the entire world has gone through grieving and bereavement because of the huge losses around COVID. And I'm not just talking about death. I'm talking about the loss of a lifestyle, the loss of the way it was, the loss of how things were, the loss of my ability to go to school, to varsity, to work, to see my friends, the loss of how I had weddings before, how we did funerals before, how we had parties before. And so there's this recurrent, almost like wave after wave after wave of loss. And in many ways, the sort of stages of grief or the stages of bereavement, we've gone through them over and over again with COVID. Never mind actual death of somebody,
I think you were reading my mind. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like because whenever we think of loss and bereavement, we're thinking like maybe death. But I don't think so. I think it's as you very nicely put just now, is the loss of everything. The loss of like going. I was telling our team is mainly remote, and I was telling them I haven't gone to movies like a proper cinema for over 2 years. And it's something we used to do at least monthly. We used to do it as a team as well, at least monthly. But we haven't done it for 2 years. And, if I think back, that's actually a loss, It's like a loss of, that utility value that it, that we got from it. But tell us, so how would a clinical psychologist normally help someone with bereavement? So I think, if we keep it simpler, maybe maybe firstly as the loss from a from a death perspective, and then I think I really love the conversation of where you went down, which is the loss of everything related to pandemic. So maybe take us through that.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll stick at the moment with the loss, the actual death of a loved one or death of somebody close to you, just because of time constraints. But I'd be very happy to chat about all the ramifications as at a later stage or something. But when somebody comes to me and they've been bereaved, first of all, it depends on their age and how the person died. So if it's COVID, I mean, that's just such an awful way to lose a loved one, because inevitably you haven't been able to say goodbye. You haven't been able to hold the person and hug them and tell them how much you love them and take your leave of the dying person. They've died in a hospital, in a COVID ward. At best, you've been allowed to go in a hazmat suit kind of thing. So there's that aspect. But generally speaking, if you want to try and make it more general and not just about COVID, then it's to meet the client where they're at. Have they just lost the person? Was it 2 months ago? Was it 3 months ago? Was it 3 weeks ago? Also makes a big difference who the person was in their lives. So working with somebody who's lost their mother is a very different, and yet in some ways very much the same, but let me say in a very different thing to process when you're a girl of 16 who's lost her mother versus a man of 90 who's lost his life partner. You would have different issues, different thoughts, different losses. In a way, the young girl would be losing anticipatory. It's everything my mother will help me with, everything I will get through in future. She's not going to be there for this and this and this and this. For the older man, it will be the loss of all the memories that he shared with her, of all the parts. So it's a retrospective loss in a way. I'm not saying it's exclusively that, but so there's no recipe for how would I deal with a client with bereavement. I've got to meet them where they're at, but definitely to find out what this loss means to them first and foremost. That would be, because nobody will ask them that. Nobody else will take the time to ask them that. The vast majority of people give you platitudes because it makes them feel better and they don't know what else to do. So they'll say, oh, they're in a better place, or they're not suffering anymore, or a number of other horrifying platitudes that people give you when you lose someone. Nobody really knows very few people know how to deal with someone grieving. They kind of want to take it away.
And as Shaz said, I know Shaz has a question, but as Shaz said, it's many, many years later after losing a loved one. And that still lingers. So it's actually, interesting what you're saying about how people almost see it in different ways. And there's no probably one recipe for okay, you need to do these things and then it's done. So I really like that aspect. The one thing I did notice though is that losing a parent, or a parent losing a child, seems to have a different, almost feel to it. It's almost when a parent loses a child, it's almost that's wrong. It's the order is all mixed up.
Absolutely.
Whereas
yes.
sometimes, as a child losing a parent, especially, if it's an older child,
Yeah.
then it's normally seems to be, okay, cool, that's the order of life kind of thing. Do you find there's anything
Very true.
around that?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. A parent is given and takes responsibility for this little life. They take complete responsibility. This little life is mine to look after. And then the child dies. And so there's going to be, no matter whether the child is 3 months, 30, 33, 53, the parent always has some sense of, this is my child and I was given responsibility. So there's this terrible guilt. What could I have done differently? What should I have done? This shouldn't have happened. This isn't the way it's meant to be. This isn't natural. I mean, it is natural, but we don't realize that. If you think about, say, for example, the animals in a wild game park like the Kruger Park, what does the lion hunt? The lion hunts the little baby. So it is perfectly natural for the babies of species to die before their parents, but we don't see it like that. We think it should be the other way around. Our parents should die and the young ones should live on to take on the next generation or to become the next generation. So if you're dealing with a parent who's lost a child, there's always going to be guilt. Even if that parent is an old lady or an old man, still going to be guilt. And when you're dealing, as you correctly said, with if my parent dies or if my client's parent dies, there's a sense of, okay, well, this is the natural order of things. But funnily enough, it's still a loss. And there can be, if you had a bad relationship with your parent, there can be so much guilt. But I didn't make amends, or I should have made that phone call, or why did I say those last words to him or her? So that's what I help people with, is those awful feelings of regret and guilt.
Sorry, Shaz, you were saying?
I was just actually going to say the same thing about it is, it's funny that people seem to talk about, how a parent feels when they lose a child, and it is absolutely horrific, or how a child feels when they lose a parent. Being in the situation I came from, what was really weird to me was I went from being the oldest child to the only child, which was the one thing. So,
Sure.
a total identity changes. But
yes.
not only that, what I found as being a young adult was everybody's first instinct was, how is your mom? Or how is your dad? And it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years later, when I'd now dealt with, okay, mom's okay, dad's okay, that I then had my breakdown. And then people were going, but why are you breaking? It's 2 years later. And I had to kind of explain to people that grief doesn't necessarily work on your timeline. And I think that's something so many people don't understand, is that it doesn't work on a timeline. There is that period of anger. There is going to be everything that comes with it. And obviously there is that sense of guilt for hundreds of reasons, but there is always that sense of guilt when somebody goes.
Yeah.
And I think one of the important things that, how would you be able, so somebody has, how do you help a grieving parent to help their child or their children? Because their children are also going to be grieving at whatever the loss it is. But I cannot imagine how difficult it must be as a parent who's grieving the loss of someone to still have to try and be there for your kids who are also grieving the loss of someone.
That's such a good question. You're right, just that people sort of forget about the siblings. They don't mean to, but they forget about the siblings, and the siblings suffer hugely because, as you say, the whole family changes when one person dies, particularly, when a sibling dies, the whole family structure, the dynamics, all of that changes. So how can parents who are grieving help their children who are grieving? First of all, I would say, to be honest, not again, it depends on the age of the children. It sounds like you were a bit older. You weren't sort of 7 or 6 or...
I was 24. So.
Exactly. So it is different for a 24-year-old sibling to, say, a 4-year-old. So definitely I would recommend that parents enlist help from counselors, from psychologists, from the school, if you're talking about children at school, and be honest about the loss. Talk about the dead person, talk about them, remember them, allow the child to talk about them, but also remember that children up until they become fully fledged adults with fully developed brains are quite self-absorbed naturally. So it is just about me today. It's not really about my dead brother when I'm 7 or when I'm 12. It's about me, and can I please go to the farewell? And so I would say enlist help and be honest with your child. Talk about the dead person, but remember that they are quite self-absorbed. So they may not miss the sibling as much as you do or in the way that you do. They would probably miss their sibling for quite selfish, if I can call it. I'm not judging them. I'm saying self-involved reasons. It would be like, oh, now I don't have my sister to help me with my hair, or now I don't have my brother to take the attention off me, or whatever the case. They miss the sibling for their own reasons. But I hope I've answered your question in terms of how could the parent help. I'd say be honest, talk about the dead person, and seek help for the child, because they might not be able to talk to you as much as they could to a counsellor because they're worried about burdening their mom or dad.
No, that very definitely answers the question, because what I've often found is, especially getting involved in the groups that I did wind up getting involved in, is that sometimes the parent is so caught up in the grief that they actually forget that there is actually another young child around. Yeah. And that's where the thing comes in of, you've got to help yourself to be able to help the child. But yeah, it definitely answers the question. Get help for yourself, get help for the child. And remember, little one sometimes isn't really bothered about the fact that Johnny's not here anymore, unless he now wants to play and he doesn't have somebody to play with. And it's not that he doesn't feel anything.
Exactly. His loss is that my mommy has been non-stop sad since Johnny died. That's his loss. I've lost my mommy. She's sitting in a heap crying. Now, I'm not saying mommy must feel guilty, but what I'm saying is mommy must just get help and understand that,
Yeah, and what I really like, Shaz, what Bronwen said as well, is that it's almost like this changing consciousness that we have, or changing society. Is like, at least now we say you need to go get help, especially in a South African context. I mean, there's so many bad things, and most of the time when something bad happens, like you say, go get help, go get counseling. And I think probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't think that was as prevalent. It wasn't that first port of call. And I think even in your case, it probably wasn't like, okay, maybe you should go get counseling. I think it was just like, okay, is your mom okay? And that's just my take on it.
I reckon. I think you're right.
And I think, I think
but
I can't
what?
remember
Interrupting you very rudely. I just wanted to say that it's places like your guys, what you're doing. It's the media, it's social media that has made the difference. The fact that you guys and people like you and social media are talking about these previously taboo subjects, that's what's helped.
Yeah, and if I were to put that straight back at you and say, it's all we're doing is doing the connection with amazing people like yourself, like healthcare practitioners, because I think lots of these things were almost like, they were in communities, but until you knew what question to ask, until you knew who to ask that from, you didn't get the right answer. It's almost like, you're at this door.
True.
And you have to say the exact, abracadabra, and then the door opens. But if you don't say abracadabra, the door is not going to open. And that's, so there is a truth to that. But, our biggest take right now, or what we want to achieve, is that healthcare practitioners have all of this knowledge. We want to bring that to mainstream layman terms, and take away the ICD-10 codes and the DSM-5 stuff, and give it to what is bereavement? What is the loss? Because that's what people are struggling with. we can tie that back to an ICD-10 code, but, that's not for lay people. That's like, and I think that's the part that we want to do. And I think we want to be brave with some of the topics. We spoke about a few weeks ago, we spoke about ADHD in adults. And I told the educational psychologist, I've been over 20 odd years in corporate. I never heard anyone in my team, any HR person came to me and said, someone in the team has ADHD. Like it just was not like in our context.
Wasn't done, wasn't said. Mm-mm.
Yeah. Whereas now that seems to be, people are brave enough to be able to say, actually, this person, we always knew something was wrong, but, maybe he needs help for ADHD. And I think that's the amazing thing, about where we are. I think, it seems to be happening on multiple fronts, healthcare practitioners maybe being more open, maybe the world being more open. Our biggest thing is that Google is not your friend. So people don't know what to ask. And hopefully when they go into this, to the Moulding Health show, they say, okay, bereavement, like, what does that mean? And they listen to the episode with Bronwen and it's like, okay, cool. I think, I can help my sister with this, or my brother or my mom with this. And maybe I should make a booking. But coming back to bereavement.
Yeah, you ask, and then I'll see if you cover my question. Carry on, or what I was going to say, you ask. Sorry.
Okay, I was going to go into the stages of bereavement. But,
okay. No, that's fine.
Okay.
Well, the stages of bereavement they have been somewhat debunked, just to begin with, but they're very, very useful in terms of understanding what you're going through if you're grieving. But they're not the way we used to think about them when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first wrote about them. They're not these steps that you follow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're at the end. It's almost like a cyclical process, but knowing that one of the first things most people go through is shock and denial. Most people. And it happened with COVID, if you think about it. The very first thing we'd said was, oh, it's just a flu. It's not going to come here. What rubbish is this? There's no such thing. Shock and denial, okay? And most people are then in touch with perhaps pain and guilt. As I said, there's always guilt, and pain is inevitable. And another stage that has been sort of noticed, but it doesn't necessarily follow denial, is anger and bargaining. Those are often seen as two different stages, but the anger would be about looking for blame, perhaps wanting to blame somebody. You're furious with World Health Organization. You're furious with the government. I'm talking about COVID, obviously, but you're furious with God. You're furious with the doctor. You're furious with the brother who died because he didn't take precautions. He drove drunk, or, whatever. You're furious. And then comes the bargaining of, well, with COVID, I guess it's, if I do this, then I won't catch COVID. And if I don't do that, then I won't catch COVID. And if I say my Hail Marys or whatever the bargaining is, this the feeling of somehow I can negotiate my way around this. That is particularly appropriate if you are diagnosed, say, for example, with a terminal illness. Then there'll be that huge amount of bargaining that goes on. And it's just trying to find a way. Again, it's a form of denial. It's trying to find a way of not accepting that this has actually happened, or that this is the way it is. Our brains struggle to just absorb that this is how it is. My daughter is dead, or whatever. Then most people go through a stage of depression. And that's not something you need to rush off and get antidepressants for most of the time. It's a natural response to enormous loss. So we even had that happening with COVID, that there was a depression. People felt a loss of hope, a loss of joy, loss of motivation, despair, down, blue, sad, lonely, all the feelings of depression. And you go through that when you lose someone you love. And then the more hopeful stages towards the end. And as I say, you can go backwards and forwards. So you can start processing and working towards acceptance, and then spiral back into anger. And so it's not from step 1 to 7 and then you're done and dusted and you can now move on. It doesn't work like that. But the final stages, if I can call them final, are reconstruction, working through, and acceptance. I don't know, if I think about my own personal experience of grief and the experience of my clients, if acceptance ever has a full stop. There's always that, what if? Or, I wish it could have been different. Or, so I don't know if I think it's more like there are 3 dots after acceptance.
I like that. I suppose, and you said it earlier, Bronwen, it depends on the manner in which the death happened. Most of the time, if it's like, if there wasn't any closure, it's always that 3 dots then in terms of acceptance, I want to ask this.
So many COVID deaths had no closure. So many of them. The person went into hospital and you assumed they'd be coming home, and the next thing you know, that you're at a funeral.
Yeah.
But anyway, I interrupted you. I'm doing a lot of this interrupting. I'm very sorry.
It must be the meeting of the minds. But I watched quite a few, and this sounds really morbid, but you get these videos on funerals, and especially in the Indian community. I mean, there's certain rites, like with if you're Hindu, that you have to do for the person that's dead. And what was weird with COVID is you couldn't do those last rites.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was the bigger thing. It's like so you watch these videos and you can check that people are more traumatized because they couldn't do these last rites, because it's almost like the person can't pass on because they couldn't do the last rites, because you can't even touch the person or anything.
Exactly.
And that was like actually quite, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about it, because it's like, such a unnerving kind of thing. But my question was going to be something on those lines. It's like, do you find, and again, this is more an opinion, it's not, every case is different, but do you find that people with more a religious background have an easier way to deal with bereavement? Because, depending on the faith, some people say, okay, he's in a better place. So it's almost like you shouldn't be, until they obviously come and see, clinical psychologists like yourself.
Such a marvelous question. That's such a marvelous question. At the risk of sounding like a proper psychologist, the answer is yes and no. Because sometimes having a faith, like you give the example of the last rites and the prayers that the Hindu people say at intervals, and specific prayers, and even the other religions have their traditions and their rituals and their rites, and it can be very comforting, enormously comforting. And for people to think that their loved one is now on the other side, which is a better place, can be very, very comforting. It really can be. It can also be a way to avoid the pain. And it can be used particularly by adherents to that faith, not the ones who are grieving, but the others, to silence the grieving one. Oh, but your mother's in a better place. Oh, but God wanted an angel in heaven. Those kinds of things. And they silence the grieving person and make them feel they have no right to their anger and their pain and their guilt and their... So it's a bit of both. That it can be very helpful and comforting, those rituals. I mean, why is it that every society on the face of the planet, from the most indigenous right the way through to all the colonizers everywhere, they have some kind of rite around death, rites and rituals from the ancient civilizations to today? So it's obviously going, at some level, it's helpful, even if it's just processing death and giving it some kind of meaning. Go for it.
I do have to agree there to some extent that, I've often seen it, that the more religious people tend to almost cope with the loss a lot better than those that aren't as stringently religious. But what I've also found is I think there's something in those rituals. And when those are taken away, that causes even greater sense of loss, because you can't now send somebody off on those rites. And I think it's the same with a lot of things. If, like you mentioned earlier, if somebody's got a terminal illness, you kind of have this person you're preparing for it. But if it's COVID or a sudden car accident or an aneurysm or,
exactly.
Any one of these things where the person was there this morning and they're not here this afternoon, that has a whole different implication on it. And I do seem to find that when something sudden like that happens, a lot of my friends that I know of who are a lot more religious tend to take that a lot harder, because there's almost that anger at God or the higher being of how could you let this happen? So I think it has its pros and its cons in that sense, because, I mean, John was here this morning and he's not here. How? So, yeah.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right, Shaz. It can complicate things. That's why I sat on the fence and said yes and no, because it wasn't sitting on the fence, because it is actually both, depending on the circumstances. If you don't have a religion or a faith, then chances are you kind of accept that death is the end of life. That is just how it is. And that there's no guarantee. We don't get promised 70 years, that 70 idea from the scriptures or from some people's scriptures. So you don't have a preconceived idea that somehow we don't die, or that we live eternally, or that there's a way out of death. And so there can be more acceptance if you don't have the faith and the religion. That death is just a part of life. Like I used the example of the wildlife animals, the impala. Death is just as much as part of an impala's life as birth is. Whereas if you have faith, then it can really, a sudden death like that, a traumatic death, a child's death particularly, or let's say, for example, a young parent with young children, those deaths that we deem unjust and unfair, they can really shake at your faith's foundations. What kind of God would allow this? What kind of God would permit this? That kind of stuff. So it can complicate stuff. It can complicate death.
Very much so. I mean, I still, in my mind, I can't comprehend like a 6-month-old child, passing away, or a 3-year-old. That must be, must be
so
quite
hard for those parents and for that family. So hard.
And I think even if you had the faith, it's maybe if you didn't have the like some spiritual background or belief, I mean, that's the end. And I would think maybe the loss would be even harder, because then you're never ever going to see the person again. Whereas some of the other faiths are saying you're going to meet up in some other time again, and then it's just like a small like a break. Whereas if you didn't have that, that's the end. You saw the person the last time, which must be quite difficult too. But coming back to the regret one, I know when my dad passed away, he was at a doctor's surgery and he had a heart attack. And the doctor, when I saw the doctor, obviously after that, he gave me this pen and he told me, this was your dad's pen. And I held on to that pen for a while. I don't know where the pen is now though. But it's interesting about that regret thing and how people, like, my brother's girlfriend or fiance now, he was saying, her dad is late now as well, but her dad's laptop, she has like a sentimental value to it, that you can't replace. It's interesting how we hold on to those things. It
is interesting. And I think in many ways it's like a transitional object, which helps us pass from one stage to the next. We do that when we're infants. We use transitional objects. So whether it's the dummy, whether it's a thumb, whether it's a blankie or a teddy or some special, and we have transitional objects which help us go from one stage of development to the next. It's the same with bereavement. And these, whether it's somebody's pen or a laptop or a doll or a sock or the shirt they were wearing or whatever it is, it's a transitional object. And often we find after some time we can let go of it. I mean, some people never do, but like you're saying, you don't even know where the pen is now.
It was just a normal big pen. It wasn't
exactly, it wasn't like this really special engraved pure gold thing.
It was interesting, that
it is interesting. Yeah, we do need these transitional objects. They help us.
Coming back to the religious one, now that you mentioned that, like how civilization, like always, almost has come up with a system around this. But coming back to the Hinduism faith, but they have like a 7-day ceremony, then they have a 16-day, they have a 40-day, and they have a 1-year ceremony. And I just wonder if that was crafted because of that closure, that acceptance thing, because every ceremony, the family gets together and they like almost mourn the loss again. But at every stage, you're almost like letting go, in a way. And not that it helps completely, I suppose, but it's interesting how that was.
No, but I do think it helps. And it's also a recognition of the grief, of the loss. It is also tying connection with the lost one. There's a connection there. There's a remembering. So as opposed to letting go, it's a remembering, bringing back, holding on to. Because a lot of successful, if I can call it that, acceptance is to not let go of my loved one, but to remember that they are within me, my memories. They will live forever, or as long as I live anyway. So you don't actually have to let go of the loved one. It's about how to hold on to them in a healthy way. So I think those rituals would help.
Yeah.
I think there are also some in other religions, as far as I know, I'm not that au fait, but as far as I know, the Jewish people also have times that they get together and say prayers and meet at certain intervals after mourning. And I think it is, as I say, universal that we have. I mean, if you think of what the Egyptians did, the embalming and the mummies and the whole, afterlife was a huge deal. So it's very interesting.
It's also, so just, we are South African. A really famous song by Johnny Clegg is Osieza, The Crossing.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Watching him in concert, he actually explains that the whole concept of Osieza and the crossing is, in a lot of the Zulu belief, is once a person has passed, there's a period where they are still amongst the family, and the crossing is when they now go to join the ancestors. And it is a beautiful way to think about it, because that also takes almost 13, 14 months. And it's that whole period of, preparing the person to now cross over to meet the ancestors. But
that's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that, because yes, our very varied cultures here all have their own rituals associated with death. Yes, and that's a beautiful image, a lovely idea. And there is some sense of a transition. And I don't know whether that is the dead person's transition or whether it's the living and the transition they have to make.
I think sometimes it's probably both. But one of the other things I like that you said was having the ability to talk about the loss, to talk about, whether that be the loss of a person or the loss of a job or, the loss of freedoms, all of them have their own ways of. But what I tend to find sometimes is, especially because people don't know how to talk to somebody who's grieving, is you never talk about the whole person. It's always only the good memories. And I'll never forget, I had somebody turn around and say to me once, but how could you say that about your sister? I'm like, but she was a,
XYZ.
She was. It's part of who she was. And by not talking about that means that, you only remember the one side. And I think sometimes, looking at things, I've often, I know people and the last thing they remember is the last way they saw something. And I'm kind of going, but, it takes time for them to get through that. And no amount of, okay, it's all right now is going to change that. So from a clinical psychologist point of view, what would you be able to almost suggest to someone when they have got a friend, a family member, a loved one, or a colleague who is kind of in that, depressed, angry, grieving stage, just to kind of help them without giving those platitudes of it's all going to be okay, or, they're in a better place. How are you doing?
So I mean, I'm glad you asked me, because that I didn't want to leave today's chat without talking about that. I would actually say that if you're going to try to comfort someone who is grieving, whether they are a friend or a colleague or anybody who you are trying to comfort, be quiet and listen. That would be my number one advice. My number two advice would be do something practical. So actually make dinner, or do shopping, or take them to the movies, or offer to walk their dog, or these are silly suburban sort of examples, but whatever it is that is practical, do something practical for the person. You can't take away their pain. You can't make them feel better, but you can be with them in their pain. You can listen to them, let them talk. You don't have to give advice. You don't have to be the clever one who knows what to say. You just have to be there, and you just have to listen and maybe make their lives a bit easier practically. Also, don't forget that they're still grieving 6 months later and a year later. We often get a lot of support. We get dozens of flowers. Well, at least in my culture, sorry, I know that other cultures don't send flowers, but you get a big fuss made, put it that way, a big fuss made after the person's died, and then people forget. So if you really want to comfort someone, message them months later.
That's
the
such
number
good
one
advice.
piece of advice is listen. Please don't think you have to tell them something to make it better. There is nothing you can tell them to make it better.
I'm so glad that she has asked that, and that we got that from you. That actually reminds me of we had a social worker, Sally, on, and we were talking about birth trauma and postnatal depression, and she said exactly point number 2 of yours, which was, just do something practical. Just make a home cooked meal, take it there.
Yeah.
Do the shopping. Just go. Do something. Don't go buy woody stuff. Because they can probably get that, but just something that shows almost like you're in that. And I thought that was so interesting. Hearing a healthcare practitioner give such practical, kind of down to earth,
It is.
And the thing about that is like no one can say they can't do that. That's like pretty easy to do. What I like about what you said, it's almost like don't just do it in the here and now, almost like set a reminder to do it in 2 months and maybe 4 months, and just send a message or something like that.
Yeah.
And
there's nothing wrong with setting a reminder. I mean, that's what these phone things are for. They are brains. There's nothing wrong.
The PAs.
Yeah.
No, I like that.
But I think we feel such pressure to say the right thing. And I've had people saying to me, I don't know what to say to her. I don't know what to say to him. And I say, don't say anything. Just listen. Ask a question. Make a cup of tea.
So here's a personal question. When people know your profession, I'm sure most of your family members do, is there more pressure on you to say something really smart?
The funniest thing I usually get from people who just meet me and find out is, oh no, so you're reading my mind. So that's the first one, which I'm obviously, then I always say, no, I don't do that unless you pay me. But I do sometimes get asked, what do you think of this or that or the next thing? I do sometimes. I guess like people will come to you if you're a GP, and then they'll ask you, what's this mole on my arm? Do you think that's dangerous? So I do get that a little bit, but not a lot. And I'm quite good at batting it away because I'm not going to do psychological work with my friends and family. That just isn't ethical. So, I mean, it does happen, but I don't feel pressure to say the right thing because I preach that there is no such thing.
Okay, cool.
It's about,
So it's just interesting. Yeah, but as you said, like nice the GPs.
Question. Yeah. Oh, everybody wants, and if you know someone's a lawyer, then it'll be, can you give me some legal advice about this, this, or this?
It's so funny, eh? I mean, those stereotypes.
It is.
Like, it's like IT people. It's like, can you fix my computer? It's like,
Please
no,
come
just
and
go
fix
buy a
my
MacBook.
computer.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm not fixing your computer.
I detect a quick Apple advert there.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I had to go through that story, that was like one of my life-saving marriage tips is like,
yes.
if, just get a computer that's like, your wife's happy with. It's like, and
Yes,
you don't have to do
yes.
IT support ever again. But I think this was amazing. I love the conversation.
Me too. I really enjoyed it.
I think we'll close off with you, Bronwen. But Shaz, anything on your side that you think we missed from the conversation?
No, I think we covered a lot of, bereavement's such a huge subject, but just some practical tips on what you can do to help somebody who might be grieving. And then again, just some practical tips of what you yourself could do if you're grieving, I think is a great help to a lot of people. And Oliver, coming back to your point earlier, 15 years ago, nobody said, just go and get help. So you do try and sort of muddle through. And if there's any advice I can give to anybody grieving is don't muddle through. Find help, speak to somebody, and don't use platitudes. Bronwen's right.
Agree with you.
It's all going to be okay, or this too shall pass doesn't bring anybody back or bring a job back or bring a lifestyle back. So I think we've covered a lot. I would just ask one question on almost the guilt side of things. There's a lot of times with grief where there is guilt. Obviously somebody commits suicide, oh my God, why didn't I notice it, or that kind of thing. But I think something that a lot of people don't speak about is the guilt that comes with making a decision to not resuscitate somebody or to actually turn off a machine, because in a way that person feels like there's always that question of what if we were wrong? What would you say to somebody in almost that kind of going through almost that phase that, but if we hadn't switched the machine off, maybe this person would have 20 years later woken up out of the coma. There's that bargaining kind of and guilt that wraps in on top of it.
It is about bargaining. It is about bargaining. I don't envy people like doctors who have to make the do not resuscitate decision. I think that must be incredibly tough. In terms of family members, you have to decide, are we going to switch off this machine or not? Or are we going to say, please don't resuscitate? If I was seeing them in therapy, for example, or possibly even with my friends, I would say, what would be the person's quality of life? Because life is not just about being alive, like on a machine, breathing. Life's also about quality of life. What is life if there's no quality of life? So my question would be, what kind of quality of life would that person have had? Yes, they might have lain for 20 years in a hospital bed, making everybody around them bankrupt, and then, I don't know, woken up with terrible brain damage. Would that have been worth it? It's difficult because, the grief, the guilt around death is partly our need to be omnipotent, our need to have some power. So that fantasy that we have, that if I had been there, I could have saved them. If I had done this, I could have saved them, or it would have been different. Or it's almost like a childlike omnipotence, that if I'd been there, I could have done something. In actual fact, you probably couldn't have.
So amazing that you said that, eh? And that question from Shaz was such a, that was a bit deeper than we even covered, throughout the show. Because I think that's probably another topic, like how would you make
I
that,
think so.
pro-choice versus, pro-life kind of thing.
It's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah. But that,
I wanted to say before I forget, sorry, I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say there is such a thing as bereavement that becomes, well, the old-fashioned term for it is complicated. I'm trying to remember what it's called now. But essentially when it no longer is normal, natural bereavement and it now becomes mental illness. And that is to do with how long the person has been struggling and whether they can function or not. To describe something as a mental illness, it's got to affect your functioning. So if after, let's say, 6 months, maybe a bit longer, depending on the person, they cannot go back to work, they cannot function, they cannot run a home, they cannot do what they used to be able to do, then we may need to consider this a mental illness and they might need to get medication and have that kind of more drastic assistance. So bereavement, if it goes on for too long, and by too long, I mean in terms of the functioning impairment. So you can miss your sister for the rest of your life. That doesn't make it complicated bereavement. But if you can't function because you're missing her so much, then it's not healthy. So that was all I wanted to say about that.
Wow. I mean, again, that one's like more complicated than like we discussed so far. But, I would take that as well. No problem. That actually is amazing. But I would take that. And so if I had to ask the question, so there's some people, my gran she's late now, but she lost, there was a reason I asked one of the earlier questions. She lost her son, when he was like 19 or something. She never recovered from that. But if you ever mentioned his name, she would like break down completely, and so does that kind of border around that part? I mean, it's almost
I would
like
have
a name.
suggested therapy for her. I would have suggested therapy for her. Yeah, okay. That's not that level of distress at the mere mention of his name is not. I hate these words, but it's not sort of normal bereavement, even for losing a child, because that is ultimately the worst thing, to lose your own child.
Yeah. And I would say it's like probably 20 or 30 years after the death as well. So
then I would have said she has unresolved grief and guilt. My guess is that it's probably guilt.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, in this case, it was because he went with, I don't know him, but he was even my mum, I don't think she knew him really well, but he went with like the neighbors or something, and then it was a motor accident or something like that. So there was that guilt aspect, that she couldn't save him. Maybe I think
exactly. It's awful.
That's so interesting and really cool. And I think all of the content was amazing. But Bronwen, on your side, is there anything around this topic that you thought we should have asked you, or you think would be useful to anyone listening to it that we should have asked you?
Gosh, I can't think of anything. I think we've covered quite a lot considering that we've had just the 1 hour. So I think that's, if you think of anything else, I'm happy to speak to you on another occasion, but
Okay, brilliant. And the point around this is as well, we'll have your contact details. So anyone listening to it and wants to take it even further, or think that you can assist them, we'll have those contact details and they can contact you directly. But let's leave it there. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bronwen.
Oh, pleasure, Shaz. Thanks for finding me.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.